Cracking conversation, analytical interpretation, and igniting imagination with the Lit and Lang Gang.
Hi guys, this is the Lit and Lang Gang, as named by you guys in Year 11. It's a podcast that we're starting to run for you so that at home you can revise from some of our notes, going over some of the literature texts or maybe some of the language skills so that you can remember at home and revise independently. Today, we're going to be looking at William Wordsworth's extract from the Prelude, which is in the Power and Conflict cluster of the poems. And you've got myself, Miss Graham, and Miss Gough.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking you through some of the context of the poem, the language structure, and the themes, so that you can hopefully revise this at home. We advise you do this with a copy of the poem in front of you. We're going to be referring to certain lines and certain quotations that you might find beneficial. So, let's talk about the context of Wordsworth.
Yes.
He's quite an interesting man, actually.
Definitely.
He is a romantic poet. I'm personally a big fan of William Wordsworth. He lived in Cumbria. He lived in Grasmere. And his whole life, he's very influenced by nature.
Definitely, yeah.
And if you kind of want to get a greater understanding of Wordsworth, remember, for AO3, you get context marks. And I think you can get good context marks if you start to talk about literary context. Those of you that are already looking ahead towards the A level, you have to talk about literary context. So if you're thinking about that, look at some of his wider works. A lot of it focuses on the power of nature. And just to give you a little idea, very famous poem, Daffodils, he wrote, goes, "When oft upon my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye that is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils." Now, in this moment, he's talking about seeing a field of daffodils and how even his memory of them elevates his mood and makes him happier.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly important because actually in this poem it's the opposite.
Yeah.
Nature depresses him.
It does. And I think he really learnt a lot of lessons from nature around him because he lived near the Lake District. So he learnt things about his own self by looking at nature, and it helped him to educate him later on in life. And you can read the full Prelude as well. It obviously journeys from childhood all the way up to adulthood, and it talks about that journey that he finds with nature. So we see a glimpse of it in this, and the whole poem is 14 sections long, so it is worth having maybe a look at it, not the whole thing.
I wouldn't. But, if you like Wordsworth, read the whole thing.
Miss Graham.
I do love him. I've been to his grave and stood there and wept. I also left flowers. Even my mother was judging me. But he is a romantic poet. He follows the idea that nature and God are the most powerful beings in existence. So when you look at a poem like the Prelude, which isn't really a story of him seeing a mountain and being scared, it's a conceit, it's an extended metaphor about the power of nature. You can see the echo of romantic themes there. He actually said about the Prelude, as Miss Gough said, this is a book he started writing. He famously didn't finish it. He died before it was done, which in many senses is very romantic because nature took its toll over man. He stated, Wordsworth, that this was a poem on the growth of my own mind with contrasting views of man, nature and society, which heavily links to all of this romantic ideas, the power of nature. Read widely, I think, around him. He's very, very famous. Was he poet laureate?
He was, and he also did an anthology with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was another famous romantic writer. They had a bit of a troubled end towards their relationship, but they have some poetry together too, which might be of interest.
Yeah, so have a look. Wider read. He's this is an autobiographical poem. This is real. So he really did steal a boat. He really did row out and see the mountain and go home and be haunted by it. Of course, though, like we're saying, it's not a poem just about that. That is essentially its surface meaning. You have to look deeper with Prelude. It is a higher level poem, so you've got to dig a little bit deeper there. All right? Yeah. We're going to move on to our second section, which is now where we're going to talk you through the language use. Some important language features that you might find useful. We'll try and point you towards direct lines where we can as well. Do you want to talk about the magic, Miss Gough?
Yeah, so we kind of get this idea of it being like an evening fairy tale kind of setting. It's like one summer evening led by her. So it's got that quality right from the get-go. And then we have like these really lovely adjectives that pop up, like glittering, small circles. I've just cut part of that apart. It's kind of reflecting how beautiful the nature and the landscape is. We've got sparkling, and then he talks about the elfin pinnace as well, and that kind of really, all of that together creates that semantic field of magic. And I think that's how he viewed nature, especially as a child. It was something magical to him, but he also took advantage of it, and I think that's something we see later on in the poem too.
Yeah.
So
it echoes up until, and we're going to refer to lines, up until roughly line 20, you get quite a lot of light imagery.
Yes.
Now, if you have a little look through, on line 9, you'll see the word glittering. On line 11, you'll see sparkling. On line 16, you'll see the word stars. Definitely creates this very beautiful imagery. It is very much, as Miss Gough said, very magical. And therefore, light imagery, if you're revising your Macbeth, then you'll know light imagery is symbolic of good and positivity. That's true of pretty much any text. It might help with your unseen poetry as well, because if there's light imagery, generally speaking, that's positive. So really, really positive. It turns dark.
It does.
Now, we've got a separate section for structure we'll talk about. But if you look later in the poem, I'm looking roughly now onto the line 22, we've got the huge peak, black and huge. But onto the second page of the poem, there's a darkness, call it solitude. It hangs over his mind. It says no colours of Greenfield, so we actually completely subvert that. We go from light to dark. And this is where he's seen the mountain by this point. He's scared by it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And again, useful for unseen poetry, useful for Macbeth. Dark imagery is symbolic of, in some cases, evil, the supernatural. In this case, it's much more like a realisation for himself. People say all the time it's a poem about a mountain. It's important to note what that mountain reminds him of. He sees that, and in that moment he's reminded of his own mortality. He looks at the mountain, sees its massive stature, is incredibly intimidated by it, because he realises how long that mountain's been standing there and how insignificant his life is in comparison to that mountain. So he remembers, I'm going to die and my life will be insignificant. I mean, the irony, it's not, because we're here studying him, but that's that moment he feels really insignificant. So he's actually contemplating death and his own death here. So it's really important that we kind of take that light versus dark to show that.
And that kind of links in with the Gothic theme that you picked out as well towards the end. So the Gothic is you often get those tropes of like a troubled character. And this, I'm going to say it kind of links with the Byronic hero as well, almost.
You might have to explain that one to me.
So often you get in, like, so Lord Byron was obviously a romantic writer as well, poet, to be correct, and he was a character that was quite troubled, and they explore that through their poetry. So often when we know about Byronic hero, we talk about this is something we can only apply now, because they wouldn't have called themselves that at the time. But looking at like this Gothic nature and someone that's isolated, a little bit mysterious, maybe we could attach it to them.
Definitely. You don't necessarily do Gothic literature at GCSE. I mean, A Christmas Carol is a 19th century novel, and a lot of the 19th century was Gothic. You might think Frankenstein, Dracula, but you've got these heavily troubled characters with really dark pasts and really dark presents. And if you look from lines 35 to 40, that comes across the way he says things like, of unknown modes of being, oh, my thoughts are hung in darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. This is very Gothic. And is to show his troubled mind. He is overwhelmed by nature and he feels really insignificant. So unlike a character like Victor Frankenstein, who's troubled by his creation of the creature, this is a man troubled by nature, and that just shows its significance over him. Just going to go through a couple of other bits of language before we move on to the structure. So he uses quite a bit of personification. Look at the very first line. One summer evening led by her. In this case, her is left a little bit abstract as to who her is, because I think the next line he says, I found a little boat and tied to a willow tree. Is her the boat? I'm more inclined to say that her is nature. And if you read the first part of the poem, up until line 20, it almost sounds like he's on a date. It does. It's quite romantic. Ironically. Sorry. That's such a bad English teacher joke. It's quite romantic. It's almost like he's a female guiding him through nature. It definitely sounds very, as we've said previously, very beautiful. It also gets, you might argue, a little bit unnerving. Around lines, is that 17 No,
Yeah, I mean,
17, 19?
Because you even see it in
20?
line 14 with the craggy ridge, and this bit here kind of like has imagery of something a little bit more
Sexual,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah.
If you look from the line, she was an elven penance. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. If you isolate words there, you've got a semantic field of sex,
Yeah, you
really.
do. You do.
This is not him saying he's sexually attracted to nature. What he's trying to show you is he desires nature and loves nature as though it's a lover. And that's what he's trying to get, that real connection he has with the beauty of it. So, as I say, think of it like a first date, or think of it like he's on some romantic mission. And so when he's sexual about it, it's like he's trying to entice nature. Emails. It's like he's trying to entice nature as a romantic.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
I just lost the pin badge. This is a very informal podcast, isn't it, Miss Gough?
It is indeed.
I think we've covered all of our
Our language. So it's moving more into the structure now.
Let's talk about structure.
Yeah.
So, the generic overview of this poem is an epic poem. If you're unsure what that means, it basically means a very long poem where you take events that are quite mundane and you make them epic. So in this case, as we say, he steals a boat, he sees a mountain, he goes home scared. Those are the events. That's literally what happens to him. Yeah. Yet that has deeper meaning. And that's what an epic poem is. Remember, it's only an extract. This is only part of the story. It's also in blank verse, which is where we have a poem in iambic pentameter, but there's no rhyme or anything like that. You'll spot the rhythm now, so do count it out. Iambic pentameter is 10 syllables a line. If you want to push it that little bit further, it's 5 iambs, where we go unstressed syllable, stressed syllable, and we do that 5 times across the line, equating to 10. So it goes through that structure. It doesn't alter from it. Okay, it's very much, what were you saying, Miss Gough? It's a journey.
It's symbolic of a journey, and because it's one stanza. I know this comes from 14 different sections to it, but it's almost like it's a journey on the page visually as well, and that is definitely what he's talking about here with his relationship with nature. So we can talk about that structurally on the page as well.
Definitely, completely agree. The most important part of the structure is that volta.
Yes.
If you don't refer to it as a volta, you might call it a tone shift.
Yeah.
If you look at line 20, we've already looked at this one, went heaving through the water like a swan, white, beautiful, all of these ideas. Next line, when from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge. Between 20 and 21, there's a tone shift. So it goes from beauty, light, lovely, to fear and dark. That is the technical term, a volta.
Yes.
And from that moment, his structure changes, not in terms of the epic poem, not in terms of the iambic pentameter, but the way he writes.
Yeah.
If you read it yourself now, just have a read through from line 20 to, I'd say like 30 onwards.
Yes.
You'll notice you'll get quite breathless. The punctuation starts to change here. So it's less, it's more fragmented.
It is.
You'll find as well, you can call it repetition of and. If you want to be fancy, you might know that when you have sentences that continually use the same connective, we call it polysyndetic listing. Yeah. And if I just read how this sounds, when from behind that craggy steep till then, the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still for so it seemed, with purpose of its own. And actually what we're doing here is we're becoming quite breathless, and it's showing his... Trying to record a podcast with a fire bell in your room is not ideal.
It's not.
We, the reader, become quite breathless because think about what he's doing there. He's rowing away. He's rowing home. He would be breathless, but he's also scared. And that's what that polysynthetic listing is doing. It's like when a child tells a story they're excited about or they're fearful. They use polysynthetic listing a lot. Another A-level link, I think that's English language
English
where they
language,
do about
and,
that.
It's really lovely here as well how that polysynthetic listing is emphasised by the use of sibilants and consonants. So there's a lot like struck and struck again, still in stature, the grim shapes, that's 24 and 25. And it's really giving this really sinister and violent tone. And then with the consonants, it's the repetition of vowel sounds within, not vowel sounds, that's the wrong one. Consonant sounds within close by words. And it really starts to give this image of how disturbed he is by nature's power.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Also, you may notice here, the punctuation completely changes. The enjambment picks up, so that's where the lines run on from one another. So you don't stop. Line 25, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. You carry on. That picks up to kind of give that flow of the boat rowing through the water. Incredibly important. I think if you're going to be talking about structure for this poem, I would be looking to be talking between lines 21 to the end. Definitely 21 to 30. Yeah. There's lots to talk about there. It's also important to note here, we talked about the personification of nature like a date. Just to link back, he personifies the mountain, and note the way here the mountain uprears its head. It's genderless, but it sounds, I mean, it's personification, isn't it? Because he's making the inanimate human, but almost monstrous as well. So there's just another element of personification that there's lots to comment on in those lines in terms of it picks up pace. It's much faster.
Definitely.
In terms of the poem, we've probably done, that's like a generic overview. What we've tried to do is go over some obvious bits that you probably are quite familiar with, and tried to chuck in some higher level things that maybe you haven't considered before, maybe some things that are new. Last thing we want to talk about, of course, is just the themes. Now, this might be arguably the most important bit for you, because we want to talk about the main themes of the poem and which poems ideally we would link them to depending on that question. I think it's undeniable. The main theme of the poem is the power of nature.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So, power of nature. And I think this one, in my opinion, I would always put with Ozymandias. That would be my choice. If I got the question power of nature, I would be hoping for Extract or Ozymandias to be my named poem. Main reason being, these two are connected by the fact it's nature over time. So for him, it's the mountain outliving him. That's what stresses him. And in Ozymandias, it's nature outliving both the man and the statue itself. So the idea of nature over time is important. But
I would then link it to Storm on the Island and then Exposure. Exposure would probably be my go-to, because I really like how you've got that refrain in there, which is repeated, and it talks about that insignificance of him, and I think that insignificance ties in really nicely with this one. And in Storm on the Island, they think they're prepared, but they're not, and it just shows how powerless they are really to nature, and that links with the next one. Yeah,
that links with the next thing. The other thing we think could come up with a poem like this is the powerlessness of humans. Powerlessness is a word, I had to check myself. So how in contrast to that, humans are very, very weak. Again, Ozymandias is a good poem still for that one. Exposure is still a good poem.
It is.
Probably a very good link would be Tissue. Tissue's very much about how humans are seemingly quite power. I mean, Tissue. What the hell is Tissue about? When we get to that one,
well, paper that lets the light shine through. And
so
the fragility of life and how so quickly it can be changed.
Exactly. So powerlessness of humans could go really well here as well with Tissue. Obviously, Wordsworth himself realises his own powerlessness, and to a same degree that is acknowledged in Tissue, though you may not like that as a suggestion.
Might want to just screw it up like a tissue.
Oh, don't
this, but
that's such a bad joke. And that's all. We've overrun ever so slightly. We wanted to keep this about 15 minutes. We've run over ever so slightly, but if you are interested in knowing a little bit more about Exposure, we've gone through that on a very, very quick overview. Each member of staff has put down in the English department an area of literature or language they feel is their expertise. These posters, I think, will be going up pretty soon.
Yes.
And if you are interested in knowing a little bit more about Extract from the Prelude, please pop in to see me. That's Miss Graham in UC7, because it is my expert poem. I absolutely love Wordsworth. I'm a big fan. Miss Gough bought me Wordsworth-themed birthday presents.
I do.
So please pop into UC7. Please feel free to ask me any questions that you've got on it, or if you've got your poem and you want to add any annotations, then that's what that little timetable is going to be there for. I think next we're going to be looking at My Last Duchess, because we're going to do your one next, aren't we, while it's just the two of us. And then each week what we're going to do is going to ask the expert to come in the English department to talk us through their poem as well, share some ideas, and hopefully, as I say, this podcast is there to maybe give you some ideas you've not considered before. Maybe something a little bit different, perhaps. You never know.
No.
Let's hope it could be useful for your home revision.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you.